You're standing in your kitchen, holding a bag of apples going soft on the counter, and part of you already knows half of them will end up in the trash by Friday. Stop, because the people who raised me would have looked at those apples and seen a jar of food that lasts a year. There was a time in this country when nothing on that counter was allowed to spoil, when a family with almost no money and no refrigerator kept themselves fed through winter using nothing but string, screen, and sunshine. That knowledge kept people alive between 1929 and the early 1940s, and most of it died quietly with the folks who used it. I can still see my grandmother Della standing at her kitchen table in the hollow, a needle and a long thread in her hands, stringing green beans one by one like she was making a necklace. I thought it was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Stay with me, because near the end, I'm going to give you a method I found written down in a government pamphlet from 1917, a Farmers Bulletin, that lets you preserve a whole harvest of food with no canning jars, no freezer, and no electricity at all. And I promise you this works if you're living on a fixed check right now, this month, with the four walls and the kitchen you already have. For most of my life, I thought these habits were just old-fashioned stubbornness. My grandmother saved everything. She dried things I didn't even know you could dry. I rolled my eyes at it the way young people do. Then I watched grocery prices climb year after year, watched my own neighbors throw out sacks of food and then worry about money in the same breath, and I finally understood that the people who came before me weren't being quaint. They were being smart in a way we forgot how to be. And somebody, somewhere, benefited enormously from us forgetting it. Let me start with the thing that shocked me most when I finally sat down and learned it properly. My grandmother didn't dry food because she wanted to. She dried food because in the winter of 1932, in the county where she grew up, there was no other way to keep it. There was no money for jars and lids some years, because even canning supplies cost cash they didn't have. Drying cost nothing. That was the whole point. You took what the garden gave you in August, when there was too much of everything and none of it would keep, and you turned it into something that would still feed you in February. Here's what nobody told me until I asked the right questions. The reason drying works is beautifully simple. Mold and bacteria need water to live. Take the water out of a piece of food, and you take away the thing that makes it rot. My grandmother didn't know the science in those words, but she knew the truth of it in her hands. She'd tell me a green bean holds so much water it'll turn to slime in a week, but pull that water out, and the same bean will sit in a sack behind the stove until spring and come back to life in a pot of hot water like it was picked yesterday. They called those dried beans leather britches. Some folks called them shuck beans. You took whole green beans, the whole pod, ran a threaded needle right through the middle of each one, and hung them in long strings from the rafters or behind the wood stove, where the air was warm and moving. In 2 or 3 weeks they were dry and leathery, and they'd keep for a year or more. When you wanted them, you soaked them overnight and cooked them slow with a little fat, and my grandmother swore they tasted better than fresh, sweeter, nuttier, richer. I didn't believe her. I believe her now. But here's where it turns, because I need you to understand something before we go any further. The knowledge my grandmother carried wasn't just forgotten by accident. Somewhere along the way, we were sold a different idea about food entirely. And the more I learned, the angrier I got about who profited from that. Think about it. For thousands of years, drying was how the human race kept from starving through winter. Then, in a single generation, in the years after the Second World War, Americans were taught that fresh was the only thing worth eating, that a full freezer was the mark of a good life, and that anything your grandmother did with a needle and thread was poverty to be ashamed of. We were handed a kitchen full of machines that all needed electricity, that all needed to be bought, replaced, and paid for month after month. And the skill that cost nothing, the skill that made a family independent, got quietly pushed into the past like it was something to be embarrassed about. My grandmother was embarrassed by it. A little. I could see it. When I turned my nose up at those strings of beans as a boy, she got quiet, and I didn't understand until much later that I'd made her feel old and backward for knowing exactly how to keep her family alive. That's the part that stays with me. We shamed the people who knew, and now most of them are gone, and the knowing is going with them. So let me hand you the beginning of it, because this is the block where I give you something you can actually use. The simplest food to dry, the one my grandmother started every child on, is the apple. Apples were the first thing I ever dried with my own 2 hands. She called the dried pieces snits, an old word that came down from the German families that settled her part of the country. You take an apple, you don't even have to peel it, you core it and slice it into thin rings or thin slices about a 1/4 inch thick. Thin is the secret. Thick pieces trap water in the middle and spoil. Thin pieces dry clean through. Then you have choices, and every one of them is free. You can lay those slices on a clean screen. An old window screen scrubbed down works perfectly, which is exactly what she used, and set it in the sun on a hot, dry day, bringing it in at night so the dew doesn't undo your work. You can string the slices on a thread and hang them near the stove. Or, and this is the one most of you will actually do, you can lay them on a rack in your oven, set as low as it goes, with the door cracked open a couple of inches to let the moisture escape. In a few hours, sometimes overnight on the very lowest heat, you have dried apples that will keep for a year in a jar or a cloth sack. They're chewy and sweet, and they cost you almost nothing, and a bag of them will outlast anything you buy at the store. Now, I told you thin was the secret, but there's a second secret that separates food that keeps from food that molds, and this is where people go wrong. Therefore, let me tell you exactly how to know when a thing is dry enough, because guessing is how you lose a whole batch. The old test my grandmother used had no thermometer and no timer. For fruit, she'd take a piece and tear it in half. If she could squeeze a bead of moisture out of the torn edge, it wasn't done, and back it went. When it tore dry, leathery, and springy with no wetness at the seam, it was ready. For vegetables and beans, she wanted them hard and brittle, so dry they'd almost rattle. Under-drying is the one mistake that ruins everything, because that little bit of trapped water is exactly what mold needs. When in doubt, she always said, dry it longer. You cannot dry a thing too much. You can only dry it too little. And here's a number that made me sit up when I finally read the research. The United States Department of Agriculture put out a document called Farmers Bulletin number 984, the farm and home drying of fruits and vegetables, and in it and the studies that followed, they found that properly dried food loses around 80 to 90% of its original weight in water. That means a bushel of tomatoes, heavy and awkward and rotting within days, becomes a small light package you can hold in one hand and store for a year. They weren't preserving food. They were shrinking a whole season down to something a poor family could keep in a corner. But water weight was only half of what my grandmother understood, because there was a bigger fear in those years than spoilage. And that fear is the reason for the next thing I'm going to teach you. The bigger fear was losing the goodness in the food. People believed, and a lot of folks still believe, that drying food strips all the nourishment out of it. My grandmother heard that too, and she didn't buy it, and it turns out she was right. Nutrition studies going back decades have shown that carefully dried fruits and vegetables hold on to most of their minerals and much of their nourishment. The iron, the potassium, the fiber, those don't leave when the water leaves. In fact, because you've concentrated the food, a small handful of dried fruit can carry more nourishment by weight than the fresh piece it came from. A single dried apricot half carries the goodness of the whole fresh apricot in a bite the size of a coin. She knew this in her body long before I read it in a study. In the lean winters, dried food was how her family kept from getting sick. There's a reason people in those years dried so many tomatoes and greens and peppers, not just to have something to eat, but to keep the color in their cheeks through the months when nothing grew. The Federal Writers Project, which sent people out in the 1930s to write down the stories of ordinary Americans before they were lost, is full of these accounts. Old folks describing rooms hung with drying food, describing the smell of apples and beans and peppers filling a house in autumn. Those oral histories are sitting in archives right now, and most people will never read them, and every one of them is a lesson somebody paid for in hunger. Here's a trick from those years that almost nobody remembers. Peppers. You take sweet peppers or hot peppers, you run a string through the stems, and you hang them in a long bright braid in a warm, dry room. They dry right there on the string, no screen, no oven, nothing. My grandmother had a braid of red peppers hanging in her kitchen every winter, and I thought it was decoration. It was food. She'd break off a dried pepper and crush it into a pot of beans, and it woke the whole thing up. That braid cost her nothing, and it lasted till spring. If what I'm describing is striking a nerve, this feeling that something real was taken from us, quietly and on purpose, I've gone much deeper into all of it in my book Depression Proof, where I lay out not just the food skills but the full money mindset that let ordinary families survive when the system stopped working for them. You can also find it alongside Deep Frugal and The Full System, all three linked in the description below. Take a look when this video is done, then come right back, because what I'm about to hand you is something you can use with your own two hands starting this week. And corn was king. They dried sweet corn by the bushel. You cut the kernels off the cob after a quick scald in boiling water, spread them on a screen or a cloth, and dried them till they were hard as gravel. Dried sweet corn, soaked and simmered, was one of the sweetest things on a winter table. Some families dried it right on the cob and shelled it later. Some ground it. The point is that a food that would rot in 3 days on the counter became a food that fed you in the dead of winter, and it cost a scald of water and a little patience. Now I know what some of you are thinking, and this next part I put here on purpose, for you especially. You're thinking this is fine for people with a garden, people with land, people with a summer harvest and time on their hands. You're on a fixed check. You've got a small kitchen, no yard, and every dollar spoken for before it arrives. I want you to hear me clearly. This was built for you. The people who invented these methods didn't have gardens some years either. They had whatever they could get cheap, and they made it last. And you can do exactly the same thing starting this week with nothing you don't already own. Here is what I want you to do, and it costs you almost nothing. Next time you're at the store, watch the clearance rack in the produce section, the one where they mark down the ripe bananas, the soft apples, the bruised peppers, the bag of tomatoes that has to sell today. That's the food nobody wants. The food they practically give away, and it is perfect for drying because ripe food dries sweeter. Buy the marked down bananas for pennies on the dollar. Slice them thin. Lay them on a rack in your oven on the very lowest setting with the door cracked. In a few hours you have banana chips that cost you almost nothing and keep for months. Do the same with those cheap apples, those soft tomatoes, those peppers about to turn. You don't need a dehydrator. You don't need a garden. You need an oven set low, or a sunny windowsill, or a warm spot near a heat vent, and a piece of screen, or a baking rack, or even a plate. My grandmother dried food in a coal-heated house with no special equipment of any kind, and the food she made that way carried her family through winters when there was no money at all. If she could do it in 1932 with nothing, you can do it in your apartment this Saturday. And let me give you the money side of it plainly, because this audience deserves real numbers. A bag of dried fruit at the store can run you $6, $7, $8 for a few ounces. A pound of fresh fruit on clearance might cost you $1 or less, and when you dry it, that pound shrinks down, but every bit of the food is still there, and you've spent a fraction of the store price. Multiply that across a year of snacks, a year of fruit for oatmeal, a year of vegetables for soup, and you are talking about real money staying in your pocket, money that right now is walking straight out the door and into the trash can every time a bag of produce goes soft before you get to it. Therefore, the question isn't whether you can afford to do this. The question is whether you can afford to keep throwing food away the way we've all been trained to. Because that training, that comfortable habit of letting food rot and just buying more, didn't come from nowhere. It was built into us. And the folks who built it knew exactly what they were doing. Let me be plain about it now, because we're past the point where I'll soften it. There is an entire economy that depends on you being unable to keep your own food. Every skill your grandparents had that made them independent, drying, saving, keeping, mending, was a skill that took a customer away from somebody. A family that can dry a bushel of clearance tomatoes and eat from it all winter is a family that isn't buying as much. A family that knows food doesn't have to rot is a family that's harder to sell to. So the knowing got buried, not with a law, but with a feeling, the feeling that this was backward, poor, something to grow out of. My grandmother felt that feeling. I helped put it on her. And it worked, because I'm nearly the last one in my family who still remembers how she did it. But I do remember. And now you're going to remember too, because I want to give you the thing I promised at the start, the method I found sitting in that old government pamphlet that changes how you think about all of this. When I went looking for where my grandmother's knowledge actually came from, I traced it back past her, back to the years around the First World War, and I found that the government itself was teaching Americans to dry food at home. That Farmers Bulletin number 984, Farm and Home Drying of Fruits and Vegetables, was printed and handed out to ordinary families so they could preserve the harvest without sugar and without tin, both of which were scarce and needed for the war. Inside it was a method so simple and so nearly forgotten that when I read it, I sat back in my chair. It was the answer to every excuse people make about drying food today. The method was this: you do not need the sun. You do not need special equipment. You do not even need a working oven if you don't have one. You need warmth, moving air, and time, and any warm, dry corner of a heated home will give you all three. The old bulletins describe building a simple drying rack from screen or slats and setting it above the kitchen stove, near the wood stove, over a radiator, near any steady source of gentle heat. The rising warmth and the moving air of a lived-in room does the whole job on its own. My grandmother's strings of beans behind the stove were this exact method. She wasn't improvising. She was following instructions that were printed and distributed to a whole nation, and then allowed to vanish. Here's how you do it in your home this weekend, and I want you to picture it as I say it. Find the warmest, driest corner you have above a heat register, near a wood stove if you've got one, on top of the refrigerator where the motor throws off gentle heat, near a sunny window that warms up in the afternoon. Take a cake rack or a piece of clean window screen and set it there so air can move all the way around your food, top and bottom. Slice your apples thin, string your beans, cut your peppers, and lay them or hang them in that warm, moving air. Turn them once a day. In a matter of days to a couple of weeks, depending on the food and the warmth, you'll have preserved food that keeps for a year, and you will not have spent a single cent on electricity or equipment to do it. And here is the part that genuinely stunned me. The detail from that old knowledge that makes it foolproof. The bulletins and the old-timers both taught a final step almost nobody knows today. After your food feels dry, you don't trust it right away. You put the dried pieces loosely in a jar or a box, not sealed tight, and you leave them for a week, shaking them each day. This is called conditioning. If any piece was still holding hidden moisture, it will spread through the batch and you'll see the tiniest bit of dampness or cloudiness on the glass. If that happens, you dry the whole lot again. If after a week the jar stays clear and the pieces stay loose and dry, then and only then do you seal it up for the long keep. That one step, conditioning, is the difference between food that lasts a year and food that molds in a month, and it's the very thing that got dropped when the machines took over and everybody stopped thinking for themselves. That's the whole secret. Warmth you already have, air that's already moving, a screen or a rack you already own, and 1 week of patience to make it safe. No dehydrator, no canner, no freezer running up your bill. A family in 1917 fed itself through winter this way. A family in 1932 survived the worst years this country ever saw this way. And you, in your kitchen, on your budget, can do it starting the moment this video ends. My grandmother Della has been gone a long time now. Toward the end, her hands weren't steady enough to string beans anymore, but she'd tell me how, step by step, from her chair, and I half listened the way you do when you think you've got all the time in the world. I didn't write it down. I wish to God I had. What I've given you today is what I managed to keep, pieced back together from her words and from those brittle old pages in the archives, and I'm handing it to you because if I don't, it dies with me, and then it's gone for everyone. What you just recovered isn't a cooking tip. It's a piece of independence that was quietly lifted out of your family's hands a couple of generations back, and you took it right back. You're the kind of person who suspects, deep down, that a lot of what we were told to buy was just a way to keep us from remembering how much we could do on our own, and you're right, and now you've got proof you can hold in a jar. So tell me something, and I mean actually tell me, down in the comments, because this crowd never speaks up, and I want to hear from you. Did anyone in your family dry food beans on a string, apples on a screen, peppers braided in the kitchen? What did they make? And do you still remember the smell of it? And tell me where you're watching from, because I read these, and every memory one of you shares is another piece of this knowledge saved from disappearing. Put it in a comment. Don't just think it, write it. If this reached something in you, subscribe and stand with the rest of us who are digging these old skills back up out of the ground before they're lost for good. Not for me, for the knowledge itself, and for the people coming up behind us who are going to need it. Next time, I'm going to show you how those same families kept eggs fresh for 6 months without a refrigerator, using one cheap thing off any grocery shelf. And once you see it, you'll wonder how we ever forgot. Bring your apples. We're just getting started. Before you go, let me tell you where this goes next. Inside the Hard Time Circle, I walk you through the full no electricity bulletin method, step by step, the part I couldn't fit here. And if something isn't clear, ask me directly, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be doing this alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. And you can cancel anytime. No risk,